And today's speaker is Katie O'Reilly. Katie is an aquatic invasive species specialist with Illinois Indiana Sea Grant. So Katie, welcome, and I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Erin, and thank you all for being here today, taking time out of your day to explore some of the, scary looking, but also scary acting creatures that we have in Lake Michigan. So it's very appropriate for this Halloween spooky season as we have the leaves changing and the nights getting a little bit chillier. So as Erin said, my name is Katie O'Reilly, and I am part of both Illinois Indiana Sea Grant, which is a program based at the University of Illinois, as well as Purdue University in Indiana, that's really focused on making the science that's happening about the Great Lakes accessible to the audiences who need it. So this is a wide variety of groups that call both states home. I'm also with the Illinois Natural History Survey based here at the University of Illinois. And what's really cool about my job is I get to talk about some of these crazy critters that we have in Lake Michigan. So as I said, the theme of today is going to be kind of a spooky theme because when we think about invasive species, they can bring to mind some, horror movie type feelings. These are creatures that cause harm, that can look rather intimidating, as the sea lamprey on the introduction slide probably made you feel. And when we think about, a potential ending, of that scary story, that horror story, what are some ways we can help manage and prevent aquatic invasive species in the future? So on that note, I want to take us all up to Lake Michigan. So I'm based in Champaign, but I often get the chance to go up to the Chicago area. And as many of you probably know, Lake Michigan is just an amazing resource, not only for the state of Illinois, but for all the states surrounding it. And it provides us with so many benefits, with, kind of natural, logical, as well as economic and cultural benefits that we all enjoy. And this is the part of the horror movie where it's like everything is nice. It's very, perfect situation. But there is a terror that lurks under the deep. And if you think about sharing scary stories around the campfire, we have this really valuable resource in Lake Michigan, but there are threats that can compromise some of those things we really benefit from. And some of these, scary stories that fish may tell around the campfire to each other are probably things that, you're not going to be all that surprised by. They include things such as pollution, whether that's from, runoff from the surrounding landscape, it's from plastic pollution. Scary stories also include things like the loss of habitat. We often convert land to different uses, and in the process, we may lose really critically important habitat for aquatic organisms like fish. But the scariest, or maybe scariest depending on who you're talking to, is often what we call invasive species. And so we're going to talk a little bit first about just what the heck an invasive species is, because you'll often see a lot of terms thrown around, exotic species, non-native species. And so we're going to talk first generally about some what we call aquatic invasive species, before actually getting into some, storytelling around the campfire about some scary real stories in Lake Michigan. So as I mentioned, there's a lot of terms that get thrown around when we talk about invasive species. And you may be familiar probably with the idea of invasive species because we have so many in the Great Lakes. This was a poster created by some of our collaborators at the Great Lakes Research Institute, or Great Lakes Research Laboratory in Michigan, where they show, that we have over 180 non-native species that have become established in the Great Lakes. And these are everything from fishes to plants to even microscopic organisms like plankton that are non-native. But you'll notice I've used a couple of different terms there that don't necessarily mean the same thing, though people often use them interchangeably. What this is saying is there's, over 180 non-native species. So these are species that are not typically found in the Great Lakes. They come from somewhere else. That could be another continent. It could even be different parts of North America. And they are established in the Great Lakes. And so when we say established as biologists, what we mean is that they're not just found in the Great Lakes, they're found to be reproducing. So they have a population that is able to reproduce in the Great Lakes. But of these 180 plus species, not all of them are necessarily what we consider invasive. And for a species to be considered invasive, it needs to meet several criteria. It has to be non-native. So there are some species that can cause problems but are native. They just can cause problems because of changes in environmental conditions, like weeds, essentially, that can spread. But for an invasive species, it has to be non-native. It has to be established. So again, that goes back to the fact that it can have the ability to reproduce. And it needs to cause some kind of harm. And when we say causes harm, that actually encompasses not only environmental harm, like, affecting native species, but also encompasses economic harm if it affects humans, if it has public health impacts. Any kind of harm falls under that umbrella. And typically invasive species share characteristics that make them invasive. And that can often be things like they're hardy, so they can persist in environments that native species would otherwise not tolerate. They can reproduce really quickly, which allows them to just really gain a foothold. And they also are easily spread. And so, none of these species made it to the Great Lakes without some kind of human intervention, which is just something to keep in mind. And I'll kind of come back to that point throughout today's webinar, but they're easy to spread in one form or another. And again, under that umbrella of harm, there's a lot of different things, if we're thinking of the horror movie analogy, there's a lot of different ways these guys wreak havoc. And, probably the first idea of harm that might come to your mind is the fact that these guys, invasive species in general, tend to outcompete our native species. And that's either because they're bigger, they're more aggressive, they're better at getting food. It can be any kind of number of ways. They also can actually modify the landscape around them. They can change the landscape in ways that make it better for them, as well as less good for native species. And then when we're thinking about, even impacts to the economy or human kind of considerations, in a lot of cases, invasive species can interfere with commerce or transportation. We see this a lot in aquatic ecosystems with things like plants that can actually block access to boat launches. And then honestly, there's a lot of, it may be less of an economic impact, though there is still definitely economic impact, but there is, a large impact on recreation. And that can be, whether you go out fishing and you're not able to catch the fish you normally would like. Maybe the view has changed on your lake because you have an invasion of a non-native aquatic plant. So there can be some economic impacts to recreation, but also just kind of socially and cultural impacts that are harder to quantify, but still negative. And just in the Great Lakes alone, where we've had many different invasions, some of which I'll talk about here in the next couple of stories, but invasive species have a very real cost, generally in the tune of over $100 million annually spent on or to deal with the impacts of invasive species. So this is very much a economic and environmental problem that has serious ramifications. But so, it's Halloween time. Everybody loves a scary movie. So I have a trio of terrifying tales for you today that sort of illustrate just 3 invasive species that we have in Lake Michigan, or we're trying to avoid having in Lake Michigan, that really illustrate sort of the past, present, and future of invasive species in the lake. And so part 1 is called Bloodsuckers. So it's the vampire side of this story with the sea lamprey. We'll then move on to part 2, Monstrous Mussels, to talk about a very small but mighty mussel problem that we've had in the Great Lakes that really illustrates some of the challenges in managing aquatic invasive species. And then finally, we'll end with creepy carp. So one of the questions I get a lot as an aquatic invasive species specialist are, what the heck are the carp doing? Are they in Lake Michigan yet? So we'll end with that as kind of a thought for the future of what does the future of invasive species in Lake Michigan look like? So grab your popcorn and get ready to see the terrifying tales of invasive species. So as I mentioned, our first part is focused on the lovable sea lamprey, using lovable there as only a fish biologist can do. Has a face only a mother could love, based, as you've clearly seen. But these guys are a really interesting fish, and at the same time, from taking off just the scientific interest of these weird looking fish, have caused major changes in Lake Michigan. So let's dive on in. So probably by this point, you've gotten tired of me showing you pictures of lamprey mouths because they look terrifying. And you're thinking to yourself, what the heck is this? So as I mentioned, a sea lamprey is a type of fish, even though it looks very much like a snake or an eel. And it's got this suction cup mouth with these rows of the teeth are made of the same material your fingernails are. So they're kind of sharp, and they've got this rasping tongue in the middle. And this mouth is perfectly designed to be a suction cup to attach to an unwitting host, most times a large fish. And they use those teeth and that rasping tongue to essentially, drill a hole into the fish. They then have secrete a compound that stops the blood from clotting, so they can continue to kind of eat fish liquid. It's kind of a mix of body fluids and blood. So very much vampire stuff we're dealing with here. The sea lamprey obviously, uses that mouth puts it to good use when it's feeding on fish, but it doesn't spend its entire life as this kind of horrifying vampire. They start out life as these tiny little larvae that have no eyes, and they live in the sediment of the rivers and streams that lead to the Great Lakes. And they actually spend a majority of their life as these filter-feeding little eyeless larvae. And it's only for about a year or so that they are these adults feeding on fish. And they're actually native to the Atlantic coast of the US, not to the Great Lakes, which is why we consider them an invasive. And you might be wondering, okay, so this is a sea lamprey, hence the name, it's in the ocean. How the heck did it get into the Great Lakes? And so the answer to that question is actually found in a site that many people have visited, Niagara Falls. So originally, there's some thought that the sea lamprey, might have been native to Lake Ontario. There are some connections with the kind of coast and how far inland they could get. But the sea lamprey was always prevented from getting to the other lakes by the natural barrier of Niagara Falls between Lake Ontario and Lake Erie. But when the Welland Canal was built, which basically allowed ships to get between the two lakes and avoid Niagara Falls, it allowed ships to get through, and it also allowed the sea lamprey to get through. So the sea lamprey was able to head into the upper Great Lakes, Lake Michigan, Lake Huron, where it became pretty firmly established by, the early mid 20th century. And once it was there, it found a feeding frenzy. And one of its preferred feeding frenzy, host was the lake trout, which was the top predator, native top predator in the Great Lakes, in Lake Michigan and Lake Huron. And in some places where sea lamprey are native, they've evolved in conjunction with their hosts. And so the hosts don't necessarily, they can deal with the lamprey a little bit better. But the lake trout had not evolved with the sea lamprey as a, parasite. So they really took a beating. In some cases, a single sea lamprey could destroy over 40 pounds of fish in its lifetime. And we had, millions of sea lamprey when it came to about the mid 20th century. Things got really bad around the 1950s. And that's when the US and Canada actually came together and were like, we need to do something. The sea lamprey has decimated the fishery in the lake. How are we gonna control this? And that was even made, not only was there this impact to the fishery, it had these cascading food web effects because that lake trout was this native top predator. You then had an explosion of lower trophic level fish, lower in the food web. And so things actually like another invasive species, the alewife, were able to gain a foothold and grow a lot because they had no predators to kind of keep them in check. And it's also important to note at this time, we didn't have the Pacific salmon, the coho, the Chinook salmon. Those would be introduced later on. So you really have this gap of time in the 1950s when there's just no top predator in the lakes. And that's when the alewife were able to establish. Some of you might remember back in the 1960s, 70s, there would be these big piles of like dead alewife rolling up on beaches. That was in part because the food web had just been so completely changed with the loss of top predators due to the sea lamprey. So obviously that we were like, okay, what do we do? How do we control this sea lamprey now that they've become such, a problem, but also they've gotten so established in the Great Lakes. And that's actually where the development of a chemical, actually a couple of chemicals that are called lampricides, so these are like pesticides or herbicides, was developed for treating sea lamprey and actually gave us a tool to manage populations. It's important to note that even with the introduction of some of these treatments, we still haven't eradicated sea lamprey. We still have sea lamprey in the Great Lakes today, 70 years on. But lampricides, essentially what they do every year, teams from across the US and Canada they use these lampricides in those streams and rivers that the baby lamprey, those larvae, live in. And by treating them with this lampricide that targets the lamprey but is not harmful to other organisms, it can kill the lamprey in that larval stage. There are also, so that's, I would say, like one of our biggest, most effective tools that's been used. But they also use some physical traps to catch adults as they come back, because the adults come back into the rivers to spawn, and that's where those larvae come from. And oftentimes you may hear a discussion about the removal of barriers like dams. One of the trade-offs we have, obviously in removing dams, we restore connectivity between a river and, lower down in the river, like the lake. But in some cases, we've actually tried to keep some of those barriers because while they stop other fish from going upstream, which is a bad thing, they also can stop lamprey from going upstream and colonizing new habitats. So it's one of those trade-offs and decisions that has to be made by managers as well. So there's the good news is we've been able to knock down the lamprey populations significantly since their peak in the 1950s. But the bad news is they're still here. So we have not been able to eradicate them despite a total control program budget that is over $20 million annually. And what's really, I think, a take-home message from this is we haven't been able to eradicate them despite, a very expensive program that has been successful, but we still haven't been able to get rid of them. And importantly, also to note is during the pandemic, there were actually a couple of years where teams were not able to get out and treat these streams, and we're starting to see an increase in lamprey population from those larvae who survived those years where, there were no treatments. And so we're probably going to see a slight increase in lamprey populations over the next couple of years resulting from that. But the bigger kind of take home is that this is something that has to be sustained. Like, even if we take a couple of years off, their numbers start to creep back up again. So this, unfortunately, is not something that seems like it's going to be ending anytime soon. And so, shifting gears a little bit, that seems kind of like a sad ending to this, but I will, promise you there will be some hope at the end. I want to shift gears into more of the current landscape of the lakes. So we said sea lampreys really were a problem back in the 1950s. We've sort of gotten a handle on them for the most part, but now we really are struggling with a relatively small invader, but one who is mighty in numbers, and that is a pair of mussels called the zebra and quagga mussels. You may also hear them referred to as dry-scented mussels because they're closely related to one another, but they're actually two different species. And so you probably have come across these if you've ever gone to the beach on Lake Michigan. You'll often see their shells washed up on the beach. They're really sharp. One of my earliest memories of going to Lake Erie, where I grew up, was going to the beach and my mom telling me to wear water shoes because the zebra mussel shells would cut up your feet so badly. So these are really sharp shells. And these guys, we'll talk a little bit about what they've done, but don't let their small size fool you. They've had kind of an outsized impact on Lake Michigan. And the zebra and quagga mussels do look pretty similar, but there are, if you ever really take a close look at them, there are some distinguishing features that help tell them apart. But first off, you're probably wondering, okay, so the sea lamprey made it in, it was able to come up that canal, make it from the ocean. How did the zebra and quagga mussels get here? And this actually is also related to transportation, but in this case, they're more like stowaways. So, the sea lampreys kind of snuck in the door we had opened for them, but the zebra and quagga mussels are actually native to Eastern Europe, kind of Eurasia area, around the Black Sea. And these guys were able to hide away in the cargo ships that go back and forth between, the US and Europe in the ballast water. So the diagram I have up here is kind of showing the typical process. So, say you've got a big cargo ship loading up at the source. So it's over in Eastern Europe. It's taking in ballast water when its cargo hold is empty to help with the buoyancy. And so when it's taking in that water, it's taking in whatever else is in that water too. And in the case of the zebra and quagga mussels, they have these really tiny planktonic larvae. So they're just floating in the water. And those larvae got taken into the ballast water and, went on a trip across the sea. And when those ships then reached ports in the Great Lakes, as they are taking on cargo, so to kind of, again, adjust that buoyancy, they'll discharge that ballast water and whatever else is in the ballast water. And so that is how we believe zebra and quagga mussels made it to the Great Lakes. We first started seeing them in the late 1980s, early 1990s, typically right around where some of our ports were. So areas like the Lake St. Clair, Detroit River area, places that have a lot of this cargo ship traffic. And as I mentioned, despite their small size, they've had this oversized impact. And now you really can't go anywhere except Lake Superior in the Great Lakes without seeing zebra and quagga mussels. Part of that is because Lake Superior is just so cold and so nutrient limited that they haven't been able to get a foothold there yet, knock on wood. But that could potentially change as climate changes, as conditions change. But in all of the other lakes, these guys are just everywhere. It was actually interesting. The zebra mussels were the first to really spread across the lakes, but we've actually seen an interesting trend in recent years that zebra mussel populations have gone down while quagga mussels have just exploded. So it's kind of like one has replaced the other, despite them having very similar impacts overall. And those impacts include, again, outcompeting native species, like we mentioned, kind of in general. What you see here on the left is one of our native freshwater mussel species that is actually just covered in dry-scented mussels. So it is essentially being suffocated by those mussels because zebra and quagga mussels will just attach to any hard surface you give them, whether it's pipes, rocks, other mussels, you name it, they find a spot, they will attach. And so, you know, we're out competing native species not only by smothering them, but by competing with them for the same types of food. And the food that they eat is actually the plankton that's in the water around them. So they're filter feeders, essentially just, you know, taking in whatever the water currents bring them. And not only does that impact how much food is available for other mussels, different fish species, especially juvenile fish that rely on these plankton, it's also had the kind of unexpected benefit of increasing water clarity. So if you've been around the Great Lakes a while, you may have noticed that Lake Michigan and Lake Huron especially have become a lot clearer. They look almost Caribbean blue waters in some cases. And while that is aesthetically pleasing, it's actually the, you know, kind of a negative impact that these mussels have had because they basically filtered out everything that's in the water column, which includes the food that's needed. So, you know, what you're seeing is really clear water, but it also means there's not a lot of food available for native species. And so this is why we've seen some pretty dramatic decreases in fish numbers. Just like we've taken away this basic food source. So while the clear water is very, you know, nice to look at, it looks like you're at a Caribbean beach, though you're in Highland Park, it's actually a negative impact that these guys have just been too good at filtering the water and now there's nothing left. And in some cases, this is actually hypothesized that it may be leading to algae blooms in places like Lake Erie, because by taking out some of the algae from the water, they've increased how much light can get in. And these guys, though they eat algae, they don't like the types of toxic algae that cause the really bad algae blooms. They like spit them out. And so because they're not eating the toxic algae and the light is getting in, it's causing more of these harmful algal blooms that we see in Lake Erie. So it's always tough because people are like, oh, the lake looks so nice, but it's like, yeah, but it shouldn't look that way. And actually Lake Michigan and Lake Huron are now clearer than Lake Superior, which is kind of known as being this clear, nutrient low lake, which is kind of terrifying in the scary story world here. But as I mentioned, you know, not only are they limited to the food web impacts, they also, zebra and quagga mussels can clog up pipes. Power plants often have to deal with like their pipes being completely blocked off by the growth of them because, again, they grow anywhere there's a hard surface they can attach to. And even kind of something we've noticed in the last couple of years is there's a thought that zebra and quagga mussels are responsible for some of these outbreaks of avian botulism, which have caused some pretty extensive bird die-offs across parts of the Great Lakes. again, because of how they're filtering nutrients from the water and then sequestering them near the bottom, it's linked to the chemical cycling of the bacteria that cause botulism. And so it's been linked to these pretty massive die-offs. So as I mentioned, small animal, big impacts. And there are some experimental treatments that people have been trying to control zebra and quagga mussels that include things like the use of chemicals, use of carbon dioxide injections, or even like in the case of small ponds, just completely drawing down the water to, dry them out. But it's important to note that where these treatments have been successful, it's generally been very small, localized ponds or like streams where they, can essentially cut off a little aquatic ecosystem and deal with a relatively small invasion. And so for that reason, it's not really feasible to treat zebra and quagga mussels at the scale of, say, like Lake Michigan. Like that's not something that is going to be feasible. And so at this point in our third story, you're probably like, Katie, this is a bunch of downer stories. The sea lamprey is not eradicated. We don't have a ton of treatments for zebra and quagga mussels. Now you're going to tell me about these invasive carp that everybody's talking about. But hang tight, and I promise there will be some hope at the end. And so we've talked a little bit about sort of the past of sea lamprey, the zebra and quagga mussels coming in the 90s, still having really major impacts now here 30 years later. And when we're thinking about the future of invasive species in Lake Michigan, the kind of elephant in the room, or I guess, carp in the room, are these invasive carps. So this is actually a group of 4 different species. You may have heard them referred to as Asian carp, or invasive carp, but it's the silver, bighead, black, and grass carp are typically our four species. So I'll say invasive carp, but generally we try and refer to them by their specific species because the 4 different species have different impacts when we're thinking about what could be their future in lake, if they would make it to the Great Lakes. And so, as I mentioned, this is not just like one Asian carp. There's 4 different species. All are present to one extent or another in Illinois. They are not, as of this taping, established in Lake Michigan. There have been occasions where we've maybe caught one, near Lake Michigan, but there's no evidence right now that there is an established reproducing population of any of these species in Lake Michigan. That is not the case for places like the Illinois River and rivers and streams more in the Mississippi River Basin, but we'll talk about that in a second. All of these carp can grow pretty large. I'll have some pictures here, but these are not necessarily your tiny fish. That in some cases they can grow up to be about 80 to 100 pounds. So these are big guys. And despite them all being 4 different species and having different impacts that I'll talk about, they all were brought to the US for similar purposes. And that was to actually be pest control in some of the aquaculture ponds in the southeastern US, places like Arkansas, where there is pretty extensive pond aquaculture for things like catfish. And the different carps all are really good at controlling the things that they eat. So we'll talk about, like plankton, aquatic weeds, invasive or not, nuisance snails. All of these things that can cause a lot of damage to aquaculture operations are also some of the target foods for these invasive carp. And so the carp were brought over from Eastern Asia, which is their native range, in about the 1970s to be these sort of natural pest control in these aquaculture ponds in the Southeast. The problem is, even though you have a fish in a pond, the pond might not be normally connected to another body of water. When you get flooding, like you often do in the Mississippi River Basin, fish can get out of those ponds. And so in around, the 1980s, 1990s, we started to see escapees, different carps being able to get out of those ponds and into the Mississippi River and its tributaries. And then once they made it into the Mississippi River, the Mississippi River is great because it is a main artery through the US, but it also means that they were able to spread pretty prolifically. So what you're seeing here is just an animation. It starts at about 1975, where you see a couple of big head silver black carp records in Arkansas. And then as the years progress, you're just seeing it spread throughout the Mississippi River, including up into Illinois, where we currently have established populations in the Illinois River making their way up closer to Lake Michigan. So you can see, over the years, it's definitely, they've taken advantage of that connectivity of the river. And why we're so worried about them is because of the different things that they eat. So I told you these are big guys, so they eat a lot. They're really voracious feeders. The big head and silver carp, so the two guys on the left, are specialists. They love plankton. So if you think back to the zebra and quagga mussels, I said they were really good filter feeders, taking the plankton out of the water. These guys also are really good at taking plankton out of the water. And so the worry here is that they are taking away plankton that is needed for baby fish, larval fish, for freshwater mussels. Again, plankton are kind of the base of the food web, and when you take that out, then you have these really cascading impacts onto higher food web levels. So that's the concern with the big head and silver carp. With the black carp, these guys actually are like really well designed for eating mussels and clams. So they have these like set of teeth in their throat that are just perfect for like crushing the shells and eating these mussels. And the concern here is that they're going to be able to, well, they have shown that they're eating some of our native freshwater mussels, which are already really imperiled. So it's kind of like the freshwater mussels are endangered enough. They don't need another stressor on top of this, which is what the black carp would provide. And then finally, the grass carp is actually really good at eating aquatic vegetation. That's, again, part of the reason it was brought over was to control weeds in ponds. But the problem is it eats a huge amount of plant matter every day, up to like 25% of its body weight, which for a 100-pound fish can be a lot. And in doing so, it's taking away vegetation that would provide habitat for other fish species. And they don't digest all of the plant material they eat. And so when they excrete it, as waste, that can actually lead to algae blooms. So there's a whole variety of different impacts that these guys have, and it's really all centered on the things that they eat. But I want to just take a minute to highlight one, what I would most consider the most infamous of the invasive carps, and that is the silver carp. So again, these are the plankton eaters, and they get their infamy from the fact that these are the guys who are jumping out of the water. If you've ever seen videos on YouTube, or seen the infamous animation here that I show, that's the poor boater getting smacked in the face by a fish. One of our concerns with them is the silver carp are really easily disturbed by boat motor sounds, vibrations, which are all really bad when you're in a boat on a river, and they will jump out of the water and can actually cause physical harm to people. As funny as that is, watching it over and over again, if you have a 70, 80-pound fish flying at you, that can cause some damage. And it affects recreation on these bodies of water. And so I'm hoping the video, playing a video during a presentation is always a gamble, but just wanting to show without the sound, or with the sound, essentially what happens when we electrofish, which is putting in a slight electric pulse into the water to help us collect fish, which is something we do as fisheries biologists. But what happens when you electrofish an area that has silver carp in them? And so, it looks a little something like a zombie movie, Night of the Living Dead, or, all of these fish just jumping out of the water. And this is very common. Here is in Kentucky, but we see the same thing in the Illinois River. And obviously it is attractive to watch. Scary, but attractive. And so you're probably like, okay, well, we shouldn't bring over adult carp. Maybe that seems like a good way to help prevent the further spread of these guys. Maybe we take them out of the river. But another thing just to keep in mind is that even though as adults they look very different than some of our native fish, when these invasive carps are tiny, like juveniles, they look really, really similar to a lot of our native species. So what you're seeing here are 3 different species all laid out together. And 2 of them are native. One is one of the invasive carp. And, even as a fisheries biologist, at first glance, I'm like, oh, those all look really similar. But, some are native, and then you have the potentially invasive. So this is just kind of a reminder, if you're ever fishing with bait, being aware that, some of these fish, especially when they're small, when they're used for bait, can look really similar. And so it's always important to, not dump your bait at the end of the day into another water body where you haven't collected it. And so you're probably at this point thinking, okay, Katie, please tell me there's something we can do about these guys. And there is, and that is really preventing them from getting into Lake Michigan, where they are not currently established. And where a lot of this is centered is right here in Illinois, particularly in what we call the Chicago area waterway system, which is essentially the Chicago River and a lot of the different, kind of canals that we've built to essentially Chicago built to send its sewage to the Mississippi River instead of going into Lake Michigan around the turn of the 20th century. And so what that did is, by trying to send our sewage to the Mississippi River through the Chicago Sanitary and Ship Canal, we connected Lake Michigan and the Illinois River, which by extension goes to the Mississippi River, inadvertently. And so now there's this permanent connection, which is still really important for transportation, for movement of commerce. But it also means that there is a connection now that invasive carp can get from the Mississippi River and Illinois River into Lake Michigan. And so what has been done in the past is actually putting in electric barriers. So if you think about like electric fences for your dog, it's almost a similar concept. It's like the bottom of the canals, we put electric anodes and cathodes that have essentially give the fish a shock. It doesn't kill them, but it dissuades them from swimming further upstream. We've also started to do some work in looking at things like carbon dioxide or noise deterrence. And a lot of this has been centered at what's being built at the Brandon Lock and Dam, which you may see in the news when you ever come up with like Asian carp stories. But they're really trying to make it so that there are some barriers that still allow commerce to go between the two, Chicago and the Mississippi River, but not allowing those fish to get through. And, some of the ways we're trying to monitor this are through new technologies like environmental DNA or eDNA, where people take water samples from places, downstream of these barriers to see if they can collect DNA from the carp. So even if they don't catch the carp itself, if the DNA is there, maybe that's a sign that the carp have made it through these barriers. So that's one monitoring tool that's being used to see, how successful these barriers are. And finally, well, what if what can we do with all these carp? This, is a huge amount of biomass. It's like 70% of the biomass in the Illinois River now is invasive carp. Like, what do we do with all of this? And so, if you can't eat them, do we try eating them? And so back in 2022, so last year, the Illinois DNR rebranded invasive carp as Kopi, playing on the word copious, in an effort to make it more palatable as a food source. And actually, it's not bad. As someone who's tried it, it actually is very much like a white fish, sort of like a tilapia. Doesn't have a ton of, it doesn't have like a fishy flavor. And unlike like the common carp, which is a bottom feeder, again, we're thinking about these plankton eaters. So they're eating high up in the water column. They're not interacting with like the sediments and potential contaminants in the bottom of the rivers. So they aren't high in contaminant load. They have this kind of white, flaky fish, texture. And so it's often used in like fish tacos. Back at the University of Illinois a couple of years ago, the dining halls were using them in burgers. So there is the potential for, eating some of them. Whether or not that will suppress their numbers in a significant way is to be determined. Right now, there's still not a ton of infrastructure for actually harvesting them, processing them, and selling them. Though the Illinois DNR does have a website where you can find shops that sell Kopi near you if you'd like to try it. But it's not bad. And so you're kind of thinking at this point, okay, you've told me 3 stories and only one of them has a semi-happy ending. Is that really the end? And what it is no. The story of the Great Lakes is still being written. It's always being written. The lakes are always changing. And, some of that are these, there are always new species that are knocking at our door, essentially. The 4 I show you here are just a few that we're sort of on alert for. There's whole watch lists that agencies have put together of like species that could potentially be an impact. And so what we try and do as scientists and as outreach people is tell people about some of these threats, or, give them the tools that they need to kind of stave off those invasions. Because if there's something, I hope you take away from today, it's that once a species gets here and gets firmly established, it's really tough to get rid of them. And so if we're trying to think about, how do we make these scary stories have happy or happier endings, it's really being preventative. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure, and that's especially the case when it comes to managing invasive species. We also have to keep in mind that the lakes themselves are changing. The environment around them is changing, the climate is changing, and so even species that maybe before wouldn't have been successful invaders in the Great Lakes because they were too cold or there wasn't, there was too much ice cover, we have to kind of be prepared that some species may now be able to be successful where they weren't before. And so that just gives more urgency to the fact that, we have to remain vigilant in this. And, there's obviously a lot of scientists working on this. And honestly, it really requires an all hands on deck approach. So when we think about the scientists doing research in this area, it's not just biologists or ecologists, but we also need the help of economics experts, social scientists, because as I mentioned right at the beginning, these species don't necessarily get here themselves. There's human pathways that help them. And so if we can identify those different pathways, that can really help us figure out what are the best ways to prevent them and, maybe redirecting a pathway so it's not going to get here. It's also important to understand the impacts, even though that it seems like a bummer, hearing all these stories like, okay, what if this, just everything, is a negative impact. It's really important to note that some some of these invasive species have actually had positive impacts, which sounds a little counterintuitive. But for example, there's a fish, an invasive fish called the round goby, which has caused a lot of negative impacts, but it's also become a food source for things like smallmouth bass, as well as the Lake Erie water snake, which was actually threatened prior to the round gobies coming here. But the round gobies provided such an ample food source for them that it helped the snake population recover to an extent that they were no longer threatened. So invasive species generally have negative impacts, but there can sometimes be positive impacts. And it's very much a balance of like, okay, what is the full picture? What is the full story of this cast of characters that has come to call the Great Lakes home? But beyond just doing research, it also really involves, communication and outreach with everyone, because we all are impacted by lakes, streams, rivers, and we all have an interest in protecting them. And so, this is where groups like Sea Grant come in, that, trying to provide different groups, different audiences with resources about like how to identify invasive species, how to dispose of species that you may not, need anymore from your aquarium, with resources that are really based in the best available science. And so I promised I'd end, with a little bit of positivity and, hope. And that is, really the story is you can be a part of this story and you can help. And some of the ways you can do so are, if you like boating, you like fishing, spending a day at the lake, make sure that you always clean, drain, and dry any equipment. So this is things like boats, trailers, your fishing gear, before you move between water bodies. Because as we saw with like the zebra mussels, they can stow away, they can stick to your boat. And then if you take your boat to a body of water that doesn't previously have that invasive species, you can inadvertently, give them a ride, and we don't want that. So always making sure that you, take the time to clean, drain, and dry your equipment before moving between bodies of water. If you like gardening or, keeping aquaria in your house, thinking about choosing native species, especially if you have something like an outdoor water garden, there are resources to show you like native alternatives to invasive species or non-native species that can just minimize the chance of those non-native species kind of escaping containment and spreading somewhere else. And then, particularly if you are keeping pets, just being really careful about not releasing your pets. If you have a goldfish that you no longer want, oftentimes pet shops will allow you to return them rather than, dumping them in your local pond, because they can, as you can see here, they can grow quite large and cause issues. And the same goes for if you use live bait, again, for fishing, just making sure, even if you think the bait is just a native species, sometimes like we saw with the invasive carp, they can look really similar, especially when they're tiny. So just making sure that you're not releasing animals where they shouldn't be. And so, as the credits roll on this and then the scary story, ends, the lights come up, what are some lessons we can take away from these terrifying tales? The first is that invasive species can cause really extensive harm, whether that's environmental, economic, as seen by the sea lamprey, which not only had the impacts right at the beginning, or, when it was really common, but this kind of continued economic impact in treatment. If treatment options are possible, which in many cases they're not, total eradication of invasive species once it's established is not often realistic or feasible, and continued management can be pretty costly. And then finally, really the importance of being vigilant about preventing new introductions and spread. Because it is so hard to control invasive species once they're established, prevention is really the strongest tool we have in our toolbox. And so, when we're thinking about invasive carp, really thinking about strategies to prevent them from getting into Lake Michigan is going to be critical to having, success in their management. And so with that, I will just make a quick plug for next month's environmental or everyday environment webinar, which is continuing on, if we're thinking spooky season, from invasive species to bats. But providing natural and artificial homes for bats is going to be great. And I highly encourage you to sign up for that webinar as well. And I will just leave you with a couple of resources if you'd like to learn more about how to prevent invasive species. The GLANCIS, or Great Lakes Aquatic Non-Indigenous Species Information System, which is a mouthful, is a really great database of not only invasive species found in the Great Lakes, but also ones that we're watching out for. And then if you have any questions, I may have time for a couple here, but please feel free to email me with my email address on the screen. And I greatly appreciate your time today. And yeah, happy to answer any questions if there's time. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much, Katie, for sharing all of that wonderful information. I know I definitely learned some new things, and we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge. We did have a couple questions, and I know we have a few minutes left. So the first question was just about the sea lamprey, going back to that one. And they were just wondering if there are native sea lamprey in Lake Michigan, and if so, does the lampricide for the invasive impact the native ones?
Yeah, that's a great question. There are actually 4 native species of lamprey in the Great Lakes. 2 of them are non-parasitic, which is kind of interesting. So they don't suck onto fish. And 2 are parasitic as adults, but they are all like way tinier than sea lamprey. So sea lamprey grow up to be about 3 feet. Our native lampreys are typically less than a foot, less than 12 inches. And there is some concern that they will, that the lampricides do harm them as much, or do harm them, as well. But in a lot of cases, they're not in necessarily the same streams or rivers that are being treated for sea lamprey. But yeah, that is definitely a concern for our native species.
Okay, great, thanks. I was curious with the name sea lamprey. I'm like, I wonder if there are native ones in Lake. We did have a couple questions just about incentivizing capturing the carp, and then you talked about that with the copy, and just questions about taste and if they're bony. So I did put in like the choosecarpcopy.com link for more info. But as we wrap up today in our last minute, we just had one last question. If you could just talk a little bit about mussel reproduction and how that works a little bit, just so we have a little more info about how they're, besides spreading, right, by being moved around, how does their reproduction work?
Yeah, so absolutely. The mussels reproduce by essentially broadcasting out their eggs and sperm. And so you get these, when they meet up, you get these little floating larvae. So you just have a bunch of larvae floating sort of as plankton in the water column, which means they can spread really easily because it's just wherever the water takes them, and then they will settle, find their own place, and repeat the cycle ad nauseum. This is kind of different than how some of our freshwater mussels reproduce, where they need a fish host actually to take their little larvae and spread them somewhere. It's important in their developmental process. So they don't necessarily need that fish host, which again helps them just be able to shoot out lots of babies and reproduce so successfully.
Yeah, definitely. I had no idea it was different. I was waiting for you to say fish host, and then that didn't happen. So very interesting how that works very differently. So all right, well, we are at 2:00. So I did put all of the links that Katie has on the slide in the chat, and I put her email in there also. So if you have questions, reach out to Katie directly. And once this recording is live, like I said, we'll email it out to all of you. So thank you so much, Katie. And thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope to see you next month to learn all about habitat and homes for bats. Thanks, everyone.